That was a good response. Well, I'd like to say welcome and give you blessings and greetings from our church in Dauphin, Manitoba. There's 30 of us that meet there regularly, and when we're away, then there's fewer than that. So they miss us and we miss them, but I'm glad to be here. As you've heard, it's been a fun, surprise-filled weekend, and we've had a lot of fun with that. There's a lot of stories that go along with that. Ron asked me to give this seems a little loud to me, but Ron asked me to give a title for my talk, and so I just picked one out of the air. I don't know if it'll mean much by the time we're finished, but it's called The Power of One. I found out this morning that there's a book called The Power of One, and it's an excellent book, and no, this is not a book review. This is a life review. It's actually a review of 3 lives. And as Ron prayed in his prayer, hopefully from one of these 3 lives, you'll be encouraged to take something from here and do good. Because that's the only reason I speak, is to give practical lessons and practical encouragement, to give us hope for the things that we're doing or trying to do in our lives and our service to God. Now, time does not permit us to read the entire 34th chapter of Zephaniah or 2 Chronicles and then say anything about it. So I'm going to give you that as homework. And furthermore, I'm going to give you homework for 2 Chronicles in general. I don't know when the last time you read an Old Testament book, but you need to read about the Old Testament kings and those who are good and those who are bad. And I'll have more to say about that in a second. But 2 Chronicles 34 is a very interesting chapter. Also, I was going to ask, when was the last time you read the entire group of minor prophets? But instead of doing that and causing you some uncomfortableness, I'm going to say you should read the entire minor prophets. We just spent about 10 months studying the minor prophets, and while it's easy to say, well, there's nothing in there for me, I beg to differ. And hopefully some of that will come through today as well. So I'm going to summarize and tell you a little story. Josiah, the last good king in Israel. When Josiah was 8 years old, he became the king of Israel. His father Ammon was an evil man. His grandfather Manasseh was an evil man. And the fact that he was a good man kind of makes you wonder. But at 8 years old, Josiah was appointed king. So for the next 8 years, nothing much is said about Josiah. But at 16 years old, it is said that Josiah began to seek the God of his father David and seek him more earnestly. I like to think at that point that we would say, enter Zephaniah the prophet. I'll get to him in a second. Every child growing up in Israel went to Torah school when they were 8 years old. They went every day, they memorized scripture, and they were held accountable. At 16 years old or thereabouts, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, depending on who your father or who your parents were, you were pulled out of school and put to work. It appears that King Josiah decided to stay in Torah school a little bit longer and learn a little bit more about God. He learned enough about God in the next 4 years to become a major reformer and a champion for God on earth. At 20 years old, he began to purify Judah and Jerusalem. He began by destroying all of the pagan temples and shrines. He destroyed all the Asherah poles. He tore down all of the carved idols that his father and grandfather and other kings before him had erected, some of which were in the temple. He took down all of the altars to Baal. Now, Baal is a significant one because Baal required child sacrifice. They would often take their firstborn son or firstborn daughter and throw them on a fire while they were alive. And if that wasn't enough, Josiah dug up the bones of the idolatrous priests and burned their bones. Now that's a pretty good start for a young man who's only 20 years old. And he carried that out throughout the neighborhood of Jerusalem for about 6 years. When he was 26 years old, he decided it's time to rebuild, or in this case, repair the temple. So he chose a historian, he chose a treasurer, and gave them authority and money to restore the temple. And during this restoration of the temple, the workmen, in verse 14, found a book of the law. It says written by Moses. Maybe it was an original copy, maybe it was not, but it was a book of the law written by Moses, probably the book of Deuteronomy, that had been hidden by a faithful priest during Israel's long and checkered history. Josiah, upon receiving the book of the law, had the entire law read in his presence. Now here's a young man who's been, for the past 6 years, trying to do the right thing. He's dedicated himself to serving the God of his father David and learning as much about him as possible. At some point during this time, Zephaniah the prophet came along and helped him out with this. But this is a young man. And after hearing the law read, he tore his clothes and repented for fear of all of the curses that were contained within the law were going to come due. Now that's a pretty amazing thing. So our first lesson this morning is it's not what we're doing on the outside that matters. It's what's going on in our heart that matters. Now we don't know that Josiah was doing this all for popularity contest. Probably not. I believe that he was doing this for the good and purely motivated heart. But when he read the law, it changed his heart. And he tore his clothes and repented. Now this upset him. And so he sent word to a female prophet by the name of Huldah, and he said to her, "What can we do to avoid the wrath of God?" And after some time she said this, "Because you, Josiah, you, one man, you the person, Josiah, you were faithful. You, Josiah, humbled yourself, and you repented. I will spare you the curses of the law, and you will live in peace and die in peace the rest of your life." So my first example this morning is, will you be faithful to the word? As Josiah was faithful to the word. Will I be faithful to the word? Will it make a difference in your heart? So here it is. So they took the message of Huldah back to the king. Then the king summoned all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. And the king went up to the temple and to the Lord, and with all the people of Judah and Jerusalem, along with the priests and the Levites, and all the people from the greatest to the least. And there the king read aloud the law, the book of the covenant that had been found in the temple. The king took his place of authority beside the pillar and renewed the covenant in the Lord's presence. He pledged to obey the Lord by keeping all his commands, laws, and decrees with all his heart and soul. He promised to obey all the terms of the covenant that were written in the scroll, and he required everyone in Jerusalem and the people of Benjamin to make a similar pledge. And the people of Jerusalem did so, renewing their covenant with God, the God of their ancestors. So Josiah removed all the detestable idols from the entire land of Israel and required everyone to worship the Lord their God. And throughout the rest of his lifetime, they did not turn away from the Lord, the God of their ancestors. Example number 1. The power of one man, the king. Now, he was a king, but he was still a young man. Our second example is the prophet Zephaniah. Now, the prophet Zephaniah at the beginning of the book goes to a lot of trouble to explain his heritage. He is related to several of the kings that had ruled in Israel. And somehow during this time he had survived the atrocities of his relative Manasseh and made it to being an adult. And the book of Zephaniah begins. The word of the Lord came to Zephaniah. Now this is like the Spirit moving in your heart. This is not, it may come from the Word. It may be a casual mention by a faithful person that you know. It may be something that you hear just in your own heart. But the word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah. We used to sing a song, and I notice it's in our songbook. It's called, Every Time I Feel the Spirit Move. And the words are, every time I feel the Spirit move within my heart, I will pray. I will pray. I thought about leading that song, but then I thought, nah. Now, the word of the Lord that came to Zephaniah was not a good word. The main role of the prophet is to speak for God, to be the conscience of society, to be a voice crying in the wilderness. Pick your analogy. But when God taps you on the shoulder and says, I have a message for you, quite often it's going to be a challenging message. Not every time. Friday night we were here singing with a group of people from all over the valley, and a lot of the song leaders talked about the history of the song and the meaning of the song that they were leading. And I've got a book at home. It's called, what's the name of that book, Sue? Oh yeah, Then Sings My Soul. And inside that book there are bibliographies, or biographies of the people who wrote the songs. Isaac Watts, Fannie J. Crosby. These people are musical prophets to their generation. They wrote beautiful poems turned into beautiful songs, speaking on behalf of God. I taught a class one time at Christian school, and the class was just the theology of music. The gospel has been, virtually everything about the gospel has been turned into a musical poem by the hymn writers. And it's beautiful stuff. So not every time God calls on us to speak for him, it's going to be tough. Sometimes it'll be beautiful and poetic and loving. But in the case of Zephaniah, it was tough. This was his message. Say to the people, I, God, I will sweep away everything from the earth. I will crush Judah and Jerusalem with my fist. Now there's a good lead-in. I will put an end to the idolatrous priests. Now he's not talking just about the priests who are serving in the temples of the various gods around town or around the countryside. He's talking about the priests in the temple. He goes on to say, these people, these priests, worship God by day, offer sacrifices to me by day, but by night they go up on their roof and they worship the moon and the stars. Josiah's work was not done. I will destroy those who no longer worship me and or ask for my guidance. And I will reduce the wicked to heaps of rubble. Now there's not a good message to be called on to speak. On that day, the day of judgment, I will punish the leaders. And this is where we wish it would be true today, because unfortunately the leaders in our countries today, they do bad things and they get off. But I will punish the leaders. God will not have mercy, and he will not spare those who lead us into destruction. I will search with lanterns the darkest corners of Jerusalem. No one will escape. And on that day, that terrible day when the Lord's anger is poured out, nothing will save you. Not your walls, and Jerusalem was a mighty fortified city. Your walls will not save you. Not your army. Your armies and your alliances will not save you. And not your silver or your gold. Now Zephaniah was faithful to the Spirit of God as it moved him. And today, maybe God is urging you and me to speak on his behalf. It may be a good word that you need to say to somebody. It may be a challenging word that you need to speak to someone. Will you be faithful as God's spokesperson? The third person in our little drama is Hilkiah the priest. Now remember, this is a time followed by 55 years of bad leadership on the part of Manasseh, and many, many years before that. But Hilkiah the priest is now the chosen chief priest. And it's to him that the book of the law is given. And so he has a choice. Hilkiah, here is the book written by Moses, the book of law. Everything that's going on around the countryside, he's well aware of. If he has any inclination as to what's in the book of law, he knows what it says. As a good high priest, he should know what it said. Most schoolboys knew what it said. Does he take the book and give it to the king, or does he destroy it? I mean, why else would somebody hide it in the temple? Well, because there was a time when people were going around destroying the scrolls because they didn't like what was written therein. But Hilkiah was faithful to his calling. He was given a charge. He was given a responsibility to repair the temple. He was faithful to that. And so he was the one who's responsible for making sure that Josiah received the copy of the law. Now it's time for a quiz. Raise your hand. Well, don't actually raise your hand. If you think God chose these men in that specific time and place to do those specific things, do you think that all happened by accident? Well, I don't. I think God chose them. I think God directed them. I think God led them. And I think God enabled them to do what they did. And here's the second question. Do you think God has chosen you in this time and place to do something for Him? I know the excuses. I've used them. It was so easy for Josiah to do it. He was the king. Or it was so easy for Zephaniah to do it. He was the prophet. It was so easy for Hilkiah to do it because of who he was. No, it was not easy. They had a choice to make, and it came with consequences. Of the 19 kings in Israel after Solomon, 19 kings, none of them were faithful. 0. Of the 20 kings that were in Judah after the time of Solomon, 8 of the 20 were faithful. That is not good odds. Are we going to be faithful? The words that were used to describe Manasseh in the 33rd chapter of 2 Chronicles were words like evil, detestable. He offered his own children as living sacrifices. He was more evil than the pagan societies that God had destroyed because of their paganness, because of their evil and idolatrous nature. The Amalekites, you name the 7 tribes that were there before Israel came into he wiped them all out. The Moabites, everybody. Manasseh was more evil than all of them. That is not easy to overcome. Now, there is a blip in history, if you like. Manasseh was captured and taken into captivity. And while he was there, he had an epiphany. He had a revelation from God himself. And he came back and he repented. The Bible says that he repented. And he tried to lead the people back to God, but the people would have nothing to do with it. Now, there's a lesson in there, too. His son, Ammon, was more evil than himself. He only lasted 2 years, and his own officials killed him. It was not easy for these guys to make choices. There was treachery in every corner of Jerusalem. And it won't be easy for you either. And it's not easy for me. There's only a few young people left, but those of you who are parents and grandparents, you You tell your grandchildren and you tell your children that being young is no excuse either. I got to find it. There it is. "15 years ago." Well, first of all, how many of you have heard about the Ladybug Foundation? No, because it's Canadian. 15 years ago, 5-year-old Hannah and her parents were walking in downtown Winnipeg, and they saw a homeless man eating out of a garbage can. And she said to her parents, "That's not right. And that's not right." So they talked about it, and they said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And she said, "Well, I don't know what I can do. I'm only 5 years old." So what she did was she took a can, a soup can, put a lid on it, put some paper around it, and put butterflies on it. And she went to her local neighborhood 7-Eleven and said, "Can I put this here? I'm collecting change for the homeless." And they said, "Sure." Well, that was encouraging, so she did it again and again and again and again, and pretty soon it was spread all over Manitoba, and pretty soon it spread all over Canada. Today she's giving out $3 million a year in the name of homelessness. As a 20-year-old, she's been recruited and goes across the country talking to young people about what they can do to be of service in their community. The Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba just awarded her with some award that you only give to the top 0.5% of the citizens in your province. We can do whatever we put our minds to. There's good to be done. Now, every good story has an epilogue. I call this the power of one. And because these men seemingly acted on their own, but we know that's not true. Don't forget, this is Ephesians chapter 2. Don't forget that you Gentiles used to be outsiders. You were called uncircumcised heathens by the Jews. You were proud, who were proud of their circumcision, even though it affected only their bodies and not their hearts. I think I misread that badly enough that you didn't get it. The Jews called the Gentiles the uncircumcised because they were proud of their own circumcision, even though it did not affect their heart. Has to be from the heart. In those days, you were living apart from Christ. You were excluded from citizenship among the people of Israel. You did not know the covenant promises God had made to them. You lived in this world, but without hope and without God. But now you have been united with Christ. You who were once far away from God, now you have been brought near to him through the blood of Christ. Now there's more in that paragraph or section, and you can read that. But if you are a Christian, if you are a believer, then your oneness has been united with God through Christ. So you are not one alone, but you are one. Isn't that weird? You're a plural one. United with Christ. United with the Spirit. United with each other. No male, no female, no Jew, no Gentile. Together, we are one. God does not ask us to do things we can't do without enabling us and giving us the power to do what he wants us to do. Now, Zephaniah's message was not all bad. If you will be faithful to God's calling that he has chosen for you, if you will be faithful to the word, and if you will be faithful to the Spirit that is moving in you, this is the rest of the story from Zephaniah. For the Lord your God is living among you. He is a mighty Savior. He will take delight in you with gladness. With his love, he will calm your fears. And it's the most beautiful thing in the world. He, God, will rejoice over you with joyful songs. Is there anything better? I get chills sometimes when I read that. I mean, how often have you thought about God singing joyful songs over you? We just don't think about that. We think it's our responsibility to worship him and sing songs to him, but that's just who God is. When we are faithful and we do what he calls us to do, if we listen to his voice, he sings joyful songs over us.